Welcome or welcome back to Trail and Training Training. My name is Will Frantz. I'm a running coach, a strength coach. And this particular version of the podcast is kind of in the vein of the training in the car episodes we've been doing as of late, except this is more training while walking Teddy down an arroyo behind my mom's house the morning after Christmas. So this is where we are. I think the sound should actually probably be better than the car. And hopefully nobody thinks I'm insane as I just walk down this arroyo talking to myself. So today I want to talk about an email I sent out a little bit ago. First, for those of you who have been following my injury progression, things seem to be doing a lot better. For example, I've been taking a bunch of walks lately on sand and unstable environments, currently in non-supportive shoes. I haven't worn the boot in a little while, so I think we're making moves in the right direction of healing, and I'm stoked that hopefully I'll be able to run sometime in the not too distant future. Not exactly sure when that will be, but it seems sooner than it did recently. We're still definitely not quite to the place of running, but we're definitely better and closer than we were even a couple days ago. So constant improvement, trying to just make sure that we stay off of the tough stuff and hopefully get to run at least a little bit before I go make a big business trip where it'd be really helpful if I could move well, and hopefully sooner that I can run some level of distances both for my training and mental health purposes. Anyway, back to the point for the day. I sent out an email a week or so ago, I don't know, had something to do with stretching. And I wanted to dive a little deeper into it because I think that stretching gets, I don't know if it's necessarily a bad rap. I think it's just mixed messages is the problem. And when we look at stretching in terms of training, I kind of have a couple interactions with people. One of them is the almost reflexive response when someone comes to me with an injury or start talking about training or things they should be doing. It almost inevitably is, hey, this is kind of my training, this is what I do. Oh, and I know I should be stretching more. It's like halfway out of their mouth before they even think about it. Like we've said it so many times. And then there's the other side of things where people are more than ready to tell you that stretching does nothing for injury prevention. It's not helpful. There's so many studies that seem to indicate that stretching just doesn't seem to improve your risk for injury, etc., blah, blah, blah. And to be fair, I have so happily quoted those studies for a long time. And one, because it is accurate, that stretching does seem to have pretty minimal effect on injury prevention when we look at studies, but also because I hate stretching. I find it really unpleasant. I find it uncomfortable. I don't see a ton of progress with it over the long term like I do with strength training and stuff. And as a result, it's just kind of hard for me to be consistent with it. And that's not a great excuse for anything, but it's true. And this is one of the reasons why I think quite a few people are more than happy to quote studies at you about stretching, because it's just kind of unpleasant. To be honest, if we're going to make progress in stretching, it probably needs to feel a little uncomfortable. There are the stretches that can kind of feel good, and then there's the stretches that can probably actually do some help, and the latter are going to feel like work. Now, when you look at a lot of the studies, though, they just don't seem to indicate that there's a lot of progress. And this is probably really similar to like a lot of the strength training studies that show that we don't have any real benefit from an injury prevention respect when it comes to strength training. But most coaches at this point would tell you that that's silly for one of 100 reasons, right? And it's just that it involves context. It involves context in a way that isn't necessarily well defined or easily determined from a typical study format, right? So For example, if your range of motion is so shitty that you can't move how you need to move and use the muscles that you need to use, then stretching is probably going to be a helpful thing. I don't think that that should be all that controversial, right? Like if you're, I assume you're a runner if you're listening to this, and when it comes to running, like arguably the most important thing we can do, there's probably 5 things on that list, but from a muscle activation perspective, like everybody's super focused on their glutes when it comes to running, and for good reason, because it's the biggest muscle in your body, and uh, it's the thing that should be propelling you forward. So if we can't use our glutes, then that's kind of an issue, right? And if we can't use them well, it's also an issue. So if we are so if we can't create meaningful hip extension because our quads are so tight, then maybe stretching our quads would be good for not only performance, but some kind of injury prevention. Because if we're not using our glutes, and if we're not using our glutes as a runner, then we're going to be using something else because it is the thing that should be doing most of the work in propelling us forward. And if we're not using one of the biggest muscles in our body to do what it's supposed to do in one of the most complicated movements that humans do, then something else is probably going to jump in and take over, right? Like the best athletes are the best compensators. So you might not even realize what's going on here, but if we're not using our glutes well, then we're going to be using something else. And we're probably going to be using a smaller muscle that's not meant to create that much force, like your psoas, your rectum, or one of many things. And as a result, we're going to end up probably with some kind of injury, or at the very least, a more likely, at a higher risk for some kind of injury, right? So we should probably recognize that if our quads are so tight that we can't use our glutes, then it is very likely that we're going to get hurt, or at least more likely than if our quads weren't that tight, right? Same kind of thing if we look at when it comes to like training a muscle. When we look at lifting or trying to train a muscle, it like putting on muscle mass, strength training, this kind of stuff, then the muscle has to go through some kind of like length change. And say that really vaguely because it it doesn't need to be super specific, right? Like the muscle needs to get long, and then we need to use force to shorten it against some kind of resistance. And that's how we're going to make the most meaningful change when it comes to strength. Now, if we're really tight somewhere that prevents that length change, then some stretching could probably help us train better. A really good example for me is my lats are incredibly tight, the muscles in my back, and they come from your back underneath your armpit and attach on the front of your, like right near your bicep. And you don't need to know that unless we're trying to understand why it means I've never really been able to train my upper chest very well, because my lats are so tight that it pulls me into this like rounded position that is going to prevent me from actually creating a meaningful change in length in the muscles of my chest. And it's also going to prevent me from controlling my scapula very well, which is going to lead to a lack of stability, which is further going to prevent me from training things like my shoulder, chest, etc. And I don't really care too much about my upper pec development, but I do actually care that my lats are so fucking tight that it's like pulling me into this like hunched position, right? So some stretching there would not only allow me to train and lift better, but also lead to just better postural stuff. And I'm not trying to be a posture person. I think our obsession with posture is a little much, but we should have access to a wide range, or all of the range of motion that we want. And I'm limited a little bit, so stretching my lats feels like maybe a decent idea. And these things just aren't rocket science. A lot of my job is not rocket science. If you need a range of motion and you don't have it, or if you would be greatly benefited from a range of motion, more accurate, like with your glutes and your quads, for example, like you clearly don't need perfect glute engagement to be able to run. A lot of people do it. A lot of people also have low back injuries as a result of it, right? So if we would be benefited from a bigger range of motion, more access, more engagement, then stretching might be beneficial, right? Now, if we're looking at like how to do this, that's also kind of an issue, right? Like if we're looking at how to create this length in a muscle, I think that's part of the reason we probably see some studies. I haven't looked at these in a while, but I do know how studies tend to be done in this realm. And my great suspicion is that we encounter the same issues we see in studies in terms of strength training, right? When we look at strength training, you put X number of people on the same protocol for 12 weeks, and sometimes, and then we see whether or not their injury rates have differed or they got stronger, etc. And a couple problems with that. One, not everybody needs the same exercises, right? And further, not everybody's like getting the same development is going to reduce injury risk in the same way. Because like my glutes and hamstrings are really strong. I probably am not going to be super benefited by a ton more development in that range, but my quads are proportionally pretty weak. So I would probably need to train those if we're going to look at how to do some sort of injury prevention, because that'd be my lacking point. For most runners, it'd be the exact opposite, right? So we probably need to like personalize these programs. Novel idea. Further, we need to load them appropriately. So when we look at strength programs for runners, it's often some like body weight banded thing, and that's fine if we're just starting out, but when we look at them, it's often on pretty decent runners who run like marathons for a couple times a year. And past the point of like muscle activation and engagement, we're just not going to train those people with a rubber band. You need to do deadlifts, right, for glute development. We just do. Most people, when they come into the gym, after a couple weeks, we're pretty quickly up to a decent deadlift. This is definitely heavier than whatever rubber band was strapped around their knees. So we need to also create some sort of meaningful stimulus that would create a change. This is the same kind of thing when it comes to strength now, or stretching rather. So for stretching, I think a lot of us grew up with the 30 seconds before and after in a big circle kind of stuff. I don't know how old you are, but that was kind of my era of stretching. And we learned that that doesn't do a lot. For one, it is a thing that we can probably get a lot of people to do, so I can understand why we might push them that direction. But when we look at the stretching that's actually going to make a meaningful change in like a length relationship of a muscle, because what we're trying to do, you're not lengthening the muscle, we're convincing your brain that you're not going to tear it, is probably more accurate of what we're looking at, right? And the way that we send that signal is going to be stretching in an uncomfortable but not painful range of motion for 60 to 90 seconds and slowly deepening it if we can over that time. Right? So if I'm going to stretch something like my adductors, which we might call your groin or whatever, think like a middle split. Right? And this is a particular problem area for me that I have been working on. I need to exist in some position like that for like 60 to 90 seconds. And if I don't, then it's not going to create any long-term development. It'd be like me doing bicep curls with a 5-pound weight for like sets of 20. It's just not going to create, I might feel my bicep. I'll probably get a little bit of a pump because I'm just moving something, but it's definitely not going to actually create any strength change because it's just not a meaningful stimulus for me. If it is for you, that's great. It's just an example off the top of my head. So when it comes to stretching, we need to stretch at least 60 seconds, maybe more. And it needs to be uncomfortable, but not painful, right? Like we're not trying to create a pain response. We actually want the central nervous system to be on the calmer side of things. We don't want it to be hugely stressful. We want to relax. And if it feels like you're going to tear the muscle right off the bone, it's going to be really difficult to relax. But it does need to be deep enough that your body is challenged a little bit. If it just feels cruisy, then we're not actually creating any stimulus that's going to create any change, right? So we need to be there for at least 60 seconds, not this like half-hearted 20 seconds after you finish running at the trailhead kind of thing. And when we look at we should look at it a lot like we do strength training. Provide a meaningful stimulus. Do it with intention a couple times a week. Um, Take a rest day in between. If we want to look at somebody on the internet who talks a lot about this, who I really appreciate, there's a handle of someone, I can't remember his real name, but I think it's Lucas or Luke, but Range of Strength is his Instagram handle. I'm starting to program some more of this for myself and for others because it just seems like a worthwhile thing. And you don't need to do it forever. That's the other thing. I think we've spent so much time talking about how we need to do stretching after every run, and it needs to be this like 15-minute routine where you stretch up and down everything. No, if your muscles aren't tight, they're not tight. It's okay, right? Like I have pretty good hip extension. My quads are not my suffering point. So as long as I check in on them occasionally, we're probably pretty good. But for some people, that's not going to be the case. For me, it's my adductors, right? So we should, much like a strength program, we should have a very dedicated, personalized stretching program. A good time to do it is honestly at the end of your strength program because blood's flowing and moving. You could also do it at the end of a cross-training session. That'd be really appropriate because, again, blood's flowing and moving. But we want to make sure that we put in enough work and enough of a stimulus to create change. There's very likely that there's some muscles on you that are tight enough, your body thinks they're tight enough, that we're creating a limiting relationship there somehow. And if we did some form of stretching, it would probably be helpful. It's also probably not going to look like the 30 seconds of stretching at the trailhead that we all think about or that we all can grab for free on the internet. It needs to be very focused on you, like a lot of training, but this probably more than anything because we're all tight in weird places. If I've seen a big disparity across the board, I have pretty good luck at guessing where someone's going to be weak. I don't have as much luck at guessing where someone's going to be tight unless they're like incredibly hunched or their pelvis is incredibly tilted forward, then those are pretty clear. But most of the time, it's a little harder to guess. So we're probably not going to do super well with the generic program off the internet. If you want help with this, shoot me a message, DM me. I don't care. DM me on Instagram. If you have my number, text me. You can reply to one of my emails. I'm happy to give you a look. We can talk about where you might be tight. If not, play around with it and see what helps for you. But yeah, stretching, a thing that I've demonized for a very long time because I hate it, if I'm being honest. And that's not a good enough reason to not do it if I actually want to get better. Sometimes we have to do the things that we find hard. And hard is different for everybody. Sometimes it's a hard training session. Sometimes it's like 90 seconds of stretching. Sounds so stupid when I say it out loud. Sometimes it's eating more food. Sometimes it's scheduling, whatever. But we have to do the hard thing if we're going to make progress. And for me at the moment, one of those hard things is definitely on the stretching front. So hope this makes sense. Hope you have a great day. Run a couple extra miles for me, please, while my foot is, if it fits into your training program. And have some fun on the trails. Cheers. Thank you again for listening to the Trail and Ultra Running Training Podcast. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. Just a reminder, nothing you hear on this podcast is medical advice, and you should always speak with a medical professional before making changes to your training or your nutrition. If you enjoyed the podcast or found it helpful, please leave a rating or review. It tells the algorithm robots that people like it, and that means more people will hear it. Or even better, just share it with someone who you think would benefit. If you prefer a video version, head to the Trail and Ultra Running Training Group on Facebook or check out the Mountain Goat Endurance Coaching YouTube channel. Thank you again, and I hope you have a great next run.